If this video showed up for you, it's because this story is going to move you and give you chills. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of story and comment which city you're watching from. The park bench was freezing, the kind of cold that seeps through threadbare denim and settles deep into the bones. Arthur sat there, a silhouette against the fading orange light of the autumn dusk. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and approaching rain, but Arthur barely noticed. He was lost in the fog that had occupied his mind for years, a thick, gray mist that obscured who he was, leaving only fragments of a past he couldn't quite touch. He was invisible to the joggers passing by, just another shadow in a city that moved too fast. His hands, weathered and shaking with a subtle tremor, clutched a worn, green canvas bag to his chest. It was stained with oil and dirt, heavy with the weight of the only things he had left in this world. To anyone else, it looked like trash. To Arthur, it was the anchor keeping him from drifting away completely. He adjusted his grip, his knuckles turning white, staring at the pavement with vacant, watery eyes. But he had no idea that his quiet evening was about to shatter into a million pieces. Across the street, a woman walking her poodle stopped and frowned. She pulled out her phone, whispering frantically about a suspicious drifter with a strange package near the playground. Within minutes, the rhythmic silence of the park was cut by the wail of sirens. Blue and red lights washed over Arthur's face, blinding him. He blinked, the sudden brightness stinging his eyes. Confusion washed over him like a cold wave. He didn't understand. Were they here for him? He tried to stand, but his legs were stiff and the bag slipped slightly in his grip. He instinctively yanked it back, hugging it tighter. That was the wrong move. "Sir, remain seated and put the bag on the ground, now." The voice was amplified, harsh, and metallic. Arthur squinted. Two officers were behind the doors of their patrol car, weapons drawn. The world suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He wanted to speak, to say he was just tired, that he meant no harm, but the words got stuck in his throat. The fog in his mind grew denser, panic setting in. He didn't drop the bag. He couldn't. It was all he had. And his hesitation was interpreted as a threat. "I repeat, drop the bag and put your hands in the air." Arthur shook his head slowly, terrified. The defiance wasn't born of malice, but of desperation. The officers exchanged a look. The situation was escalating. The man was non-compliant, potentially armed with an explosive in that heavy bag. They needed a non-lethal option, but one that would neutralize the threat instantly. Officer Miller grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, suspect refuses to comply, requesting K9 unit for backup, possible bomb threat." The wait felt like an eternity. Arthur shivered, not just from the cold now, but from a primal fear he couldn't name. He watched as a sleek, black SUV roared up onto the curb, tearing up the grass. The back door opened, and a deep, guttural bark echoed through the park, freezing everyone who heard it. It was a sound of pure power. Out stepped a hander, leading a massive German shepherd. The dog was a machine of muscle and instinct, its coat dark as midnight, its eyes locked onto the target with terrifying intensity. This was Wolf, the precinct's top canine, a legend among the force for his speed and ferocity. Wolf pulled at the leash, sensing the tension, feeding off the adrenaline in the air. He bared his teeth, a low growl rumbling in his chest like distant thunder. He was ready to tear apart anything that threatened his handler. Arthur looked up, his vision blurry. He saw the beast. He saw the teeth. And for a split second, something flickered in the back of his mind. A memory, sharp and painful, of wet noses and unconditional love. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the terrifying reality of the present. The handler shouted, "Sir, this is your final warning. Drop the bag or I will release the dog." Arthur was paralyzed. He curled around his bag, making himself small, bracing for the pain. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the wind whistling through the trees. The handler looked at Officer Miller, who nodded. Protocol had to be followed. The safety of the public was at risk. "Wolf!" the handler commanded, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. "Fass!" Wolf flew across the grass, a black blur of kinetic energy. The distance closed in a heartbeat. 30 feet, 20, 10. The bystanders screamed, turning away to avoid seeing the violence. Arthur didn't move. He simply bowed his head, shielding the bag with his fragile body, waiting for the tearing of flesh. The sound of paws digging into the earth was like a drum roll of doom. But the bite never came. Instead of the crunch of bone, there was a sudden, violent skid. Wolf dug his claws into the turf, sliding to a halt just inches from the trembling old man. The ferocious barking cut off instantly, replaced by a strange, heavy silence that hung over the park like a shroud. The only sound was the dog's heavy panting and the erratic wheezing of the old man. Arthur slowly opened one eye, terrified. The beast was right there. Its massive head was lowered, but not to strike. Wolf was sniffing. He inhaled deeply, his wet nose twitching near Arthur's neck, ignoring the grime, the sweat, and the smell of the streets. He was searching for something else, a scent buried under years of neglect, a scent that no amount of time could erase from a loyal heart. And then he found it. Wolf let out a sound that stunned everyone present. It wasn't a growl, it was a high-pitched, desperate whimper, the kind a puppy makes when it finds its mother. The aggressive posture melted away. The stiff tail began to thump tentatively against the grass. Thump, thump, thump. But the officers were still confused, their fingers hovering over triggers. "Wolf?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. The fog in his mind swirled, thinning for the first time in forever. He looked into those amber eyes and saw a reflection of a younger, stronger version of himself. Is that you, buddy?" Wolf didn't need another invitation. He collapsed onto his stomach, crawling forward until he could rest his heavy head squarely on Arthur's lap. He let out a long, shuddering sigh as his old man's shaking hand reached out to bury itself in the thick black fur. "It's me," Arthur sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. "It's Arthur." The police handler, Officer Davis, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He had never seen Wolf behave like this. This dog was a weapon, trained to neutralize threats without hesitation. Yet, here he was, acting like a lapdog with a homeless stranger. Davis lowered his weapon, signaling the others to hold fire. Something was wrong. Or maybe something was incredibly right. "Hold your fire," Davis shouted, walking slowly toward the pair. "Wolf, heel!" Wolf ignored the command. He pressed closer to Arthur as if defying the entire world to separate them again. Davis approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the man, then the bag. "Sir," he said, his voice less aggressive now, laced with confusion, "do you know this animal?" Arthur looked up, and for a moment the vacancy in his eyes was replaced by a steel-like clarity. "I trained him," he rasped, "when he was just a pup. He used to chew on my combat boots."
Davis frowned. That was impossible. Wolf was a military transfer, acquired from a specialized canine unit years ago. His original handler was listed as deceased in action. "Check the bag," Arthur whispered, pushing the green canvas forward. "Please, Just check the bag. Davis signaled Miller. Miller holstered his weapon and stepped forward, reaching for the bag with trembling hands. He expected wires. He expected drugs. He unzipped the main compartment and dumped the contents onto the grass. There were no bombs. Out tumbled a folded, moth-eaten military uniform, a pair of worn dog tags, and a framed photograph. The glass cracked. Miller picked up the photo. It showed a younger Arthur, standing tall and proud in fatigues with a clumsy German Shepherd puppy in his arms. The puppy had a distinctive white patch on his paw, the exact same patch Wolf had. Miller turned the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, Sergeant Arthur Vance and Wolf, partners for life. "Dispatch," Miller's voice shook over the radio. "Run a background check on a Sergeant Arthur Vance, retired military." The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. Arthur continued to stroke Wolf's ears, murmuring soft words that only the two of them understood. The dog was making soft crying sounds, licking the salt from Arthur's tears. The radio crackled back to life, the dispatcher's voice urgent. "Officer Miller, that's a code 0. Sergeant Vance is listed as MIA, presumed dead 6 years ago, after the convoy ambush in Syria. If you have a subject matching that description, proceed with extreme caution. He's a war hero." Davis looked at the homeless man shivering on the bench. He looked at the dog who had found his lost master against all odds. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They had almost attacked a ghost. "It's him," Davis whispered, holstering his gun. "My God, it's really him." But as the adrenaline faded, Arthur's strength began to fail. The emotion was too much for his frail heart. He slumped sideways against the bench, his hand slipping from Wolf's fur. "Arthur!" Davis yelled, rushing forward. Wolf barked, a sound of pure panic this time, standing over his fallen friend, licking his face frantically. The reunion had been too intense, the shock too great. "Get a medic, now!" The sirens wailing again, but this time they weren't coming to arrest a criminal. They were coming to save a legend. As the darkness crept into the edges of Arthur's vision, the last thing he felt was the warm, steady weight of Wolf's head on his chest, anchoring him to the earth. But would help arrive in time to save the man who had already lost everything?
The first thing Arthur noticed was the smell. It wasn't the exhaust fumes of the city or the damp rot of the park leaves. It was sharp, clean, and sterile, antiseptic and starch. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, steady beeping. Beep, beep, beep. Arthur forced his heavy eyelids open. The harsh fluorescent light of a hospital room flooded his vision. Panic instantly seized his chest. The park, the police, the gun, and Wolf. He tried to sit up, gasping, but a gentle hand pushed him back down onto the pillows. "Easy, Sergeant. You're safe." It was Officer Davis. He was sitting in a plastic chair by the bed, his hat in his hands, looking exhausted but relieved. Arthur looked around frantically, his heart rate spiking on the monitor. He didn't care about his health. He didn't care about the warmth of the blankets. "Where is he?" Arthur rasped, his voice weak. "Where is Wolf?" Davis smiled, a genuine, soft smile that reached his eyes. He pointed to the foot of the bed. "Hospital policy says strictly no animals," Davis said quietly, but the chief decided that for a decorated war hero and his canine partner, we could make an exception. Besides, he refused to leave the ambulance. Arthur lifted his head. There, curled up on a thick blanket at the end of the bed, was Wolf. The massive dog was asleep, but the moment Arthur stirred, his ears perked up. He lifted his head, those amber eyes locking onto Arthur's immediately. Wolf didn't jump or bark. He simply stood up, walked carefully up the length of the bed, avoiding the tubes, and rested his chin gently on Arthur's chest, right over his heart.
The steady thump of the dog's tail against the mattress was the only medicine Arthur needed. He stood guard over you for 6 hours while you were out, Davis explained, his voice thick with emotion. The doctors say you were suffering from severe malnutrition and exposure, but the trauma, the memory loss, I think the explosion that separated you two in Syria caused a dissociative fugue. You forgot everything, Arthur, until you saw him. Arthur stroked the soft fur behind Wolf's ears, the tears flowing freely again. The fog was gone. He remembered the training fields. He remembered the heat of the desert. He remembered the blast that threw him into darkness. And he remembered the guilt of thinking he had left his partner behind. I thought I lost him, Arthur whispered to the room. I thought I died. You came back, and so did he. The next few days were a blur of activity, but of a good kind. The story of the homeless veteran and the police dog who refused to attack him had gone viral. The precinct was flooded with calls. A representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs arrived with a thick file. Arthur was not just a homeless man. He was a man owed years of back pay, benefits, and honors. He wasn't destitute anymore. He was Sergeant Arthur Vance, and he was coming home. But there was one final hurdle. Wolf was technically police property, an active duty asset worth thousands of dollars to the force.
On the day of Arthur's discharge, the chief of police walked into the room. He looked stern, holding a clipboard. Arthur felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He tightened his grip on Wolf's collar. He wouldn't let them take him, not again. Sergeant Vance, the chief said, his voice booming. Officer Wolf is a highly trained asset. He has 5 years left of service on his clock. Arthur opened his mouth to beg, to plead, to offer every cent of his pension. But the chief ripped the paper off the clipboard and handed it to Arthur. However, the chief continued, his expression softening into a grin, it has come to our attention that Officer Wolf is no longer responding to commands from anyone but you. He is deemed operationally compromised due to excessive loyalty. Therefore, effective immediately, K9 Wolf is honorably discharged into your custody. Arthur stared at the paper, his hands trembling. Honorable discharge. Owner, Arthur Vance. Thank you, Arthur choked out. Thank you. The chief saluted. No, Sergeant. Thank you. The walk out of the hospital felt like a dream. The automatic doors slid open and the fresh air hit Arthur's face. But this time, it wasn't cold. The sun was shining. He wasn't walking alone in the shadows anymore. He walked with his head held high, his hand firmly gripping the leash. Beside him, Wolf trotted proudly, his tail high, scanning the world not for threats, but for new adventures. They walked down the sidewalk, an old soldier and an old dog, two broken pieces of the same soul, finally put back together. As they reached the corner, Arthur stopped. He knelt down, ignoring the ache in his knees, and looked Wolf in the eye. Let's go home, buddy. Wolf barked, a happy, sharp sound that startled a few pigeons, and licked Arthur's face. They say dogs are man's best friend, but sometimes, in the darkest of nights, when the world has forgotten your name, a dog is more than a friend. He is the witness to your life, the keeper of your soul. Arthur saved Wolf when he was a puppy, but that day in the park, Wolf returned the favor. And that is why you should never ignore the quiet ones, the broken ones, or the loyal ones. Because inside every forgotten chest, there might just be a hero's heart beating, waiting for the right voice to call it home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone you love. You never know who needs to hear this today. See you in the next video.